All right, welcome to the very first video lecture of Western Civilization 1. We are kind of getting to the real meats and bones of the course, and our first stopping place is going to be here in Mesopotamia, basically Iraq in modern terms. And it is here that we have what's known as the so-called cradle of civilization, which is one of the many terms that we use for Mesopotamia. And between here and Egypt is really where we see most early civilizations kind of begin. And we'll talk about Egypt, of course. But right now, just remember, we're going to have multiple lectures and PowerPoints, and you're going to kind of work through those. And this is where we're really going to start. So, we're going to go ahead and get right on into this. And this opening slide here is what's known as the Royal Standard of Ur, Ur, which is one of the major cities in southern Mesopotamia. It's inhabited by a group of people known as the Sumerians, who we're going to talk about in just a little bit. The Royal Standard of Ur is interesting for a lot of reasons. First, just to kind of let you know, it's split here. This little gap here indicates that there's a front and a back to this, but it's this kind of wedge-shaped piece of decorated wood, really, and it's kind of like a flag standard, and it's not a flag, though. It's just a piece of wood that's kind of very heavily decorated. And as you look at it, it's pretty easy to understand, honestly. If you look in this top left corner here, you have this giant person here. And then the rest of it is a bunch of other smaller people presenting the big person with goods and stuff like that. Guys loaded down with goods and bringing it to them. And obviously, the Mesopotamian Sumerians are showing that we are presenting goods to the what they called the Lugal, or the big man, right? And, the governor or the king, but the Sumerians didn't quite call them kings when this was made. The Lugal is kind of the guy that's just in charge, and they're bringing him taxes and tribute. So this is a hallmark of civilization, if we're being honest here. It kind of shows us, even in the earliest civilizations, there is a social hierarchy and government that is centralized, where people pay homage to him and bring him stuff, okay? Now, before we get into some of the details about the life of people who lived in Mesopotamia, I'd like to kind of talk about the geography here of the ancient world. And the first several cultures we're talking about are here in the ancient Near East. This slide kind of shows you where this is at, and we call it the Middle East because it's kind of the current Middle East, but in ancient terms, we call it the ancient Near East, and a lot of that is due to kind of European centrism and stuff like that, but you're nearer to Europe than you are from Europe, so you kind of have to note why they call it that, and it's still a term that we kind of generally use, and so we might as well play along with it, right? So generally, the ancient Near East refers to the region from the Aegean coast of Turkey, which is way up here, the Aegean coast of Turkey, all the way down here to the Persian Gulf. And so it goes down through Syria and into Egypt. You could probably take and make that Egyptian line even further south down into here. Another way to reference is because the Mediterranean, it's also called the Eastern Mediterranean. So these are terms that are kind of synonymous. The Eastern Mediterranean and the ancient Near East. Again, it includes modern Iraq, and it's essentially this first part that we're going to call Mesopotamia that we're going to be talking about. As we kind of zoom in on that region, you see two rivers here, the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Now, Mesopotamian history dominates the study of this region as a whole, Mesopotamian culture. Just note that ancient history is full of very dark and bright periods. Dark means less sources, not that like they didn't have lights. It doesn't mean anything terrible happened necessarily. Dark just means we don't have a lot of information. A bright period in history kind of says, hey, we've got a lot of sources and we know more about it. So this is simply based on the abundance of, or lack thereof, of information that historians and archaeologists kind of classify this as either dark or bright. So what are the sources? Well, in short, there are hundreds and thousands of texts on stone monuments, or most importantly, probably clay tablets. Now, unlike Egypt, where most writing was done on papyrus, and it's less likely to survive, but I mean, not to say that we don't have stuff from Egypt, we do. The most apparently mundane and ridiculously boring records survive from Mesopotamia because, you know, they put them in stone. Like we have stuff that's like, some guys like, I had 3 sheep and 2 sacks of barley, which I traded for his 2 goats and 1 garment, you know. They're mostly straightforward, boring transactions, and we have hundreds and thousands of these texts. And despite, you know, the last 150 years of study and excavation, there remains thousands of unexplored sites to find more of this stuff. It's an uncountable number of untranslated text that modern politics plays a sad and unfortunate role here, in that some of these places are not very accessible to scholars, right? Like it's not easy to get into some places in Iraq and Iran because obviously they're politically unstable, and we kind of have to keep that in mind as we study this. Now, Mesopotamia itself means the land between 2 rivers, and the term comes because of the Tigris and Euphrates, pretty obviously, and that's an obvious quiz question there. Those 2 rivers, from time to time, you know, they would flood, and it created this really good area for civilization to start. So here's the Tigris and Euphrates. In terms of just modern pictures, I guess you could say that we have 2 peaceful-looking rivers, right? They're nice rivers, but they're also pretty scenic places. And the Tigris is right there, and you can see some farmland next to them as we look at these 2 rivers, and they look nice. I mean, they provide vegetation and irrigation and all of this. Note that these 2 rivers, the Euphrates is generally much easier for ancient people to irrigate and navigate. The Tigris has more rapids. It's generally rockier. I mean, it's not like the Nile, which is way easier for ancient peoples and their tools and technologies to work. But still, the Mesopotamians do a pretty amazing job of harnessing the power of these 2 rivers. If we zoom out for a second here, we would also look at the big picture geographically. Again, it's the ancient Near East. It's, of course, an inherited region. It's an arid region, but it's not purely desert. There's a lot of people who think that it is, right? We think, oh, the Middle East, that's just a bunch of deserts. Actually, there's a lot of vegetation there, and we have a very large difference in topography. It's arid right across the Arabian Desert, obviously, but over here it's very lush, and as you go and look around those 2 rivers, you have a lot of growth there. Same thing in Egypt with the Nile, lots of growth there, and that's why civilization really thrives here. There's a lot of different ecosystems, and it's also important to note that this is at the crossroads of 3 continents, right? You have Africa, you have Asia, and you have Europe. It's a perfect place to develop civilization and have the best and brightest survive through trade networks, and then it kind of goes into westward into, you know, what we know now as Western civilization. You know, that doesn't start with the Greeks. A lot of textbooks say, hey, the Greeks, you know, they started Western civilization, but really, these groups down here in Mesopotamia, they really are the first real civilizations, and Egypt's right there with them. The Greeks come much later, and they're undoubtedly important to Western civilization. Not saying that they're not, but the Greeks are much later. And so it's not gold, it's not silver, it's not food. All those are important, but it's how these people have the ability to contact each other and and the ideas that they shared, that's what really makes these the earliest civilizations. And so this crossroads where all three of these continents kind of come together really make it the best place for these things to thrive. So it's obvious, and you can't miss it. Well, they need a constant water source, not for drinking water, obviously, to sustain life, but they need it for growing things, right? And having clean water is really the most obvious thing needed for civilization. This area provides that. And so for irrigation purposes, these are also extremely beneficial. Now, the earliest farmers used what was called dry farming, which is sort of a strange statement because it's really rain-fed, but they called it dry farming. And if you have enough rain, that's great. But if you don't, then what do? You have to irrigate the rivers. And so if you don't have irrigation of the rivers, you can't support these big, giant populations. And so you end up with nomadic people moving around with, goats and sheep and moving and chasing after grass, right? But and a civilization like that is never going to turn into a giant civilization. For that, you need the rivers, okay? So what they did was they took the river and they cut canals across the land to connect the rivers. And that was the first way to irrigate. Pretty simply, they just made a little trail of water, right? And this gives the fertility to Mesopotamia that makes it the place to give birth to civilization as a whole. It doesn't come easy. It's back-breaking work. Lots of work to try and make these canals and irrigation tracts work with basically human hands, right? But the rivers, while they provided life, they were also very destructive, okay? And while irrigating the rivers may have given you more sustainable water, it also opened up your crops to being destroyed by flooding and stuff like that, which did happen quite often. So it was life-giving, but it could also be really, really detrimental. And you can continue to see here, it's most Mesopotamia, mostly desert with a river valley. River provides the irrigation. So wherever the river irrigates, that's where the floodwaters could reach. There you have life. Where they don't reach, it's basically a desert, straight up. Here's this aerial view, and I think it's really fascinating to show how it works today. It's not really much different, even though our technology is way better than the Mesopotamians. Basically, we're doing the same thing today to irrigate this area than they did then. You have canals, you have drainage ditches, you have all of these things that are spreading the water from these life-giving rivers to the more arid regions so that you can grow food as far as you can basically dig a trench, okay? Now, when the rivers flood, they leave behind this very, very nutrient-rich soil. We call it topsoil, right? And today, you can go to Lowe's or wherever, and you can just buy a bag of topsoil, right? We are super-duper spoiled. But back then, they had to wait, and they had to make this kind of happen themselves so that they would have more land to farm. All of it creates very important things for our course. Number one, it produces a food surplus that allows civilization to advance. And here we are, basically. I mean, civilization thrived because of these innovations that they came up with. Now, not everybody is involved. Once they learn how to really harness agriculture, everybody's not involved in getting food every day anymore. And you can do other things other than just hunting and gathering. So you don't have to be nomadic anymore. And it takes a lot less effort to feed your family and to feed a large group of people. And so now that we're not just producing things, we can have specialization of jobs. It supports people becoming, creating pottery and blacksmithing and all these jobs, right? And it's really an interesting idea that once we domesticate animals and have that, civilization just takes off like dead sprint. It took forever to get to where we needed, to where this was possible. And then all of a sudden, it's like we just see boom, 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 growth. Okay, so these people, they domesticate plants and animals. We call this time period the Neolithic, which means the New Stone Age. And it's in this time where people transition again from hunting gathering to living in civilizations along rivers. Now, we have pets. This is not quite like having pets. I mean, they're domesticating animals, but for food purposes, right? Although they did have pets. I mean, there's evidence that they started domesticating dogs thousands of years before even this. But what about plants, right? What's a domesticated plant? Well, how about wheat? You take something that you find growing randomly, and all of a sudden, we systematically start to grow that. And so we go from having wild grains that we can't really count on all the time to domesticated grains. And we change the way that they grow, and we change the way that we harvest them. And domesticating grain is just as important as it is to domesticate the animals for use. We'll get more food out of the grain, and we make it a little more wind resistant. We set it up to where it can grow in better conditions. And so the bottom line is it's really, really important that we kind of get this. Now, on the bottom down here, you kind of have this little hut here, and you've got like little lambs, right? And I guess a ram's here. And what are they doing? Well, if you look at it, there's a lot of evidence that says at night they would bring all these animals and they would bring them into their huts. Why? Well, it gets cold in the desert. And so this little carving of stone kind of shows like, how did they keep warm? How did they do all these? How did they domesticate? What did they use them for? And it's pretty comical to think about, but it's also like really interesting to see. We think, oh, domesticated, that's just so they could eat them and use them to plow the fields. No, they domesticated them so they could use them for heat and get milk from them. And this is all part of civilization and developing civilization. Now, we have several civilizations that appear in Mesopotamia over the course of a couple centuries. You have Babylon, Akkad, Assyria, and the main force of our discussion today, the kind of thrust of these groups forward. We're going to not worry too much about Babylon and the other groups right now, but we're going to look at, because we're going to come back to Mesopotamia and talk about it more, but right now what we're really looking at is Sumer, okay, Sumer. Now, what you're looking here in the middle, this is the big cow thing. This bull is the so-called Great Lyre, or a lyre, the musical instrument, not to be confused with like liar, who's like a person who's dishonest, but it's a lyre, like a harp, and it was found in tomb PG 789 at Gural. Obviously, you don't need to know where it was found, but incredible craftsmanship, as you can kind of see. You see the details of this bull's beard. Of course, the Sumerians, they love their beards. And you can see kind of these very beautiful carvings underneath. It's the bull itself is gilded, so it's covered in gold. It's not made of gold. They put like a gold foil over it. It's a status object, right? It's a wealth object. It was found buried alongside 3 women who were probably musicians for the royal court. And it's interesting. It's a very expensive piece. A seriously expensive instrument. It makes you wonder, what was the status of these 3 women, right? It's not like these were not human sacrifice victims. These were like really important people. Unfortunately, we don't get a lot of supplemental evidence to a lot of things, but and we don't know about it as much about Mesopotamia as maybe we know about Greece and Rome. But again, we do have some objects that kind of lend to our understanding of what these people did. And again, their artistry and stuff like that, that's only possible from having people that have a long time to practice doing these things. And the reason they had a long time to practice making such amazing statues and carvings and instruments is because they have more food than they need, which we're going to kind of address 1,000,000 times, okay? So, if you have court musicians, you have to have kings, but villages are just peasants organized by priests at the local temple. This is a man named Urnon, or Urnon Shea, and he is the ruler of a city named Lagos. In the early dynastic era, one of the very first cities, he carries on his head a basket with mud for the very first brick, right? They're going to make bricks out of mud, dry it out in the sun, and you can see here he's got a basket, and these little notches there on the top is those mud bricks up here, okay? And this is basically a ground breaking ceremony. It's similar to that. He's going to go lay the foundation for the temple in the neighboring town, which he also rules, right? And so you see here that we have depictions of this great ruler going to spread, and he's part of the groundbreaking ceremony, the ribbon cutting, right? And so it's kind of really pretty funny. And we have writing here, all this writing, all this little chicken scratch stuff. That's all writing, and we're going to talk about what all that means, in the next lecture. But they're basically telling us a story here that basically people came and they brought their goods to him, and he's off to go build this temple, and he's going to lay the first brick, and then he's going to, I'm sure, sit down and watch everybody else build the rest of the temple. But he's going to be the one that lays the first brick. Again, you don't have this if you don't have food surplus, and you can't build these kind of things if you don't have specialized craftsmen. Metal architecture, stoneworking, pottery, and so forth. And so all of this, because we have specialized job, people all of a sudden realize like some jobs are more important than others, and you end up with this hierarchy, this social stratification throughout society where wealthy elites rule. And you can say, well, that's negative, but humans do this. We organize our societies, and someone takes charge, and that leads to governments and all of that. But looking at this here, we have pottery, okay? And pottery is really important. It goes hand in hand with food, right? What's the point of growing a food surplus if you have more grain than you need and you can't store it safely? You got to keep the mice and the birds and all that out of it. You can't just put it in a pile in the yard. It'll go bad. So you have to learn how to make pottery to store it and transport it and facilitate trade. You also need pottery to cook. And so it's actually really interesting how much pottery we have that has survived and what that says about their society. Their pottery is very durable. It breaks, but it doesn't erode or burn up. So there's quite a bit of this left that has lasted, over 5,000 years in some cases. You have specialized labor. You start building monuments. You've got these houses developing. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that you're going to end up with a full-on town or a city. The ancient Sumerians, again, the first Mesopotamians, they built dozens of cities. The three prime most important are Ur, Uruk, and Nippur. And we're not going to have time to talk about each one of those, but do note that the Sumerians built some very impressive city-states. It also leads to a huge population growth and a huge potential to grow even bigger. There are some limitations, some new problems that emerge from this process in settling these cities along the rivers, competition for water. Some city upriver puts up a dam. What are you going to do? You take your army, you go kill everybody and tear down the dam so that you have your food source, right? So you end up with competition for resources and wars as these city-states develop. And again, this is the other side of the royal standard of Ur, and you can see that it has chariots and war and all these people, and they're paying homage to the king, right? So even down here at the bottom, you see that this is defeated person being run over by the chariot, okay? It's pretty obvious that we're going to have war and kings that kind of advance from these societies as they fight for resources. So Sumer is the first civilization. They probably descended from those new Stone Age populations. As they settle and settle and settle, they say, okay, let's have a full-on civilization, call themselves the Sumerians. One thing you want to note is Mesopotamia, I would say, they're not Babylonian, they're Sumerians. Okay, so You may not be able to tell, but there's having some technical difficulties here in this recording. So I'm going to just kind of start back on this page right here again. I'm not sure what all got saved and what didn't. So if this is restated, then that's fine. Sumer is the first civilization. They descended from those new Stone Age populations in Mesopotamia. They settle all of these different areas, and then they ended up saying, hey, well, let's just turn this into a big civilization. So again, they're the Sumerians, okay? Mesopotamia is the word for the region. It's not the word for the people, okay? So the first group of people that settled in Mesopotamia was the Sumerians, okay? So they're not like Mesopotamians. Mesopotamians is a word that is used for all the different civilizations that were in that area. Now, Sumer is actually a lot of different independent city-states, not just a single nation. You can see on this slide that they never actually unify into a really great kingdom. They're more, again, city-states that compete, a lot like ancient Greece. And we'll get into that in a few weeks, more about the Greeks. But this is very similar to that. There is some really interesting things about Sumer. There's some texts that talk about big, giant public assemblies that they had before they had kings. And so historians have said the Greeks were the first civilizations in Athens to have democracy. And you know, yeah, that's great. The democracy the Greeks have, that was an impressive achievement. But now there's a lot of data that suggests the Sumerians had actually been doing these giant public assemblies, very democratic assemblies before there were kings, and then the priests took over. And so it's really kind of interesting to think that the Sumerians here in the cradle of civilization were actually that first group that may have had some democratic leanings. So they had a lot of job specialization, organized religion, so much, but they also had a lot of monumental architecture. And looking at that architecture, this is a ziggurat. And looking at this one, this is the ziggurat of Nanan, or the ziggurat of Sin, the moon deity. And what it is basically a temple. They're not pyramids, which are like burial tombs in Egypt. They're ziggurats. They're kind of in the same kind of formation as a pyramid, tall, rectangular, or almost a bit triangular, you know. And if you connected, you know, the lines going up to the top in each level, yeah, it would kind of look like a pyramid. But each level was a temple, and it kind of built up, and then here up at the top of the ziggurat would be, you know, the dwelling place of the gods, and the ancient people believed that this is where they lived. And so you can see as you climb the stairs, you know, the majesty kind of grows as you get to the top. It's a physical experience that was meant to impress you by the God who lives at the top. They love this stuff. They love putting gods on top of mountains and on these huge buildings. It was, in no doubt that it's very impressive architecture. And you could not do this without organized labor of some kind. And so you also had to, I'm sure, like, you're not going to have a bunch of guys just get together and be like, hey, let's build a temple, right? You have a government that's in charge of these things. So it kind of shows some really impressive geometrical acumen as well. And so it's very similar to kind of how we talk about the wonders of the pyramids in Egypt. Same thing here in the Mesopotamia area with ziggurats, okay? Here you can see kind of what was left of a ziggurat, and you can see that the top part is pretty much collapsed here, that it's kind of gone, but this is a ziggurat that is still standing, okay? And it's really kind of a common image, you know, that is out there that, you know, you can do a quick Google search of ziggurat, and this is going to pop up. So the fact that it's still there gives some really, really interesting views into how much understanding the Sumerians had and how impressive it was for them to be able to pull this off in, say, like 3000 BC. Again, the only other civilization doing this is the Egyptians, which is the next big civilization. Here you see again, this is kind of just one of the pictures from the ground level, looking at that one from the last slide there, that you can see here the top is missing. So if you go down and took a picture on the ground, I mean, look at this. This is unbelievable. But that wraps up lecture number 1. Appreciate it, and we will come back and talk more about the writing systems and customs of Mesopotamia in the next lecture. Thanks.